In the 1930s, the infamous Cleveland Torso Murders paralyzed America, leaving even legendary lawman Eliot Ness utterly baffled. But half a century before that American nightmare began, its precise blueprint was already being drawn across the Atlantic, hidden within the fog-choked streets of Victorian London. It was a damp, bitter morning when carpenter Frederick Wildbourne descended into a dark, unfinished cellar. As he worked among the shadows, a heavy, sickening odor caught his attention, leading him to a strange, tightly bound parcel concealed in the gloom. Carefully pulling back the coarse wrapping, Frederick expected to find discarded scraps. Instead, he recoiled in absolute horror. Inside lay a gruesome discovery so chilling, it would soon terrify even the most hardened detectives in the city. To understand how this phantom eluded the grasp of history, we must step back slightly to the year 1887. London at this time was a city of stark, jarring contradictions, celebrating Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee with immense imperial pride, while simultaneously choking under a dense shroud of yellow coal smoke and industrial grime. Beneath the glittering surface of the empire lay an expansive web of poverty, desperate slums, and dark alleyways, where human life was startlingly cheap. Cutting directly through this sprawling metropolis was the River Thames, which had evolved into a murky, foul-smelling highway for heavy commercial vessels, and, more covertly, an open dumping ground for the city's most toxic and unsightly waste. It was a massive, fast-flowing, watery graveyard, perfectly suited for anyone wishing to make something, or someone, disappear forever without leaving a single trace behind for the authorities to uncover. The true horror began to reveal itself on a dreary day in May of that year, far downstream from the crowded city centre in the quiet, isolated marshes of Rainham, Essex. A group of local labourers working near the riverbanks noticed a large, awkwardly heavy bundle floating sluggishly among the reeds and river debris. Intrigued and expecting perhaps a cache of smuggled goods or valuable discarded materials, they managed to haul the sodden canvas package ashore and carefully sliced through the tightly knotted ropes. What spilled out into the mud was a sight that instantly shattered the peace of the quiet village. It was a human torso, cleanly and brutally severed, completely devoid of a head, chest organs, or limbs. There were no clothes, no identifying marks, and no clues left behind, leaving the local police completely baffled by a fragment of a person who seemed to have materialized out of nowhere. The psychological impact of this discovery on the local community and the investigating detectives was profound and deeply unsettling. This was not a typical crime of passion, born of a sudden drunken brawl or a robbery gone terribly wrong, where a panicked killer hastily hid a body in a desperate bid to escape justice. Instead, this spoke of an entirely different kind of monster, one who viewed human flesh with a chilling, clinical detachment. The victim had not merely been murdered, she had been systematically dismantled, treated not as a human being with a life and a name, but as raw material to be processed like clockwork machinery in a slaughterhouse. This mechanical reduction of a person into unrecognizable anatomical scrap stripped away the last remaining dignity of the deceased, leaving the public with a haunting sense of vulnerability. When forensic pathologists examined the remains in the dimly lit local mortuary, the evidence they uncovered pointed to a deeply calculated and methodical operation. The incisions on the flesh were remarkably clean, showing an intimate, almost professional familiarity with human anatomy, particularly in the way the limbs had been separated at the joints without shattering the heavy bones. This level of precise dissection required immense patience, a steady hand, a variety of specialized tools, and above all, time. The medical examiners quickly realized that such a gruesome task could never have been executed in a dark, frantic alleyway under the constant threat of a passing police constable. The killer possessed a secure, well-lit indoor sanctuary, a private laboratory or workshop, where he could bleed, carve, and pack his victims in complete, undisturbed silence while the chaotic, noisy life of Victorian London carried on just outside his shuttered windows. At the time, the police at Scotland Yard viewed the Rainham horror as an isolated, albeit gruesome, tragedy of the slums, entirely failing to recognize the dark pattern that was quietly beginning to form in their city. They focused their efforts on local missing persons reports, searching for a single missing woman, while the true architect of the crime watched their futile efforts from the safety of the shadows. The authorities remained completely blind to the fact that a patient, highly disciplined serial predator was currently refining his deadly craft right under their noses. But the killer was just practicing. His masterpiece of mockery was yet to come. By the first week of October 1888, London was a city held hostage by its own shadows, completely paralyzed by a relentless, creeping dread. The infamous Autumn of Terror was at its absolute peak. Just days earlier, on September 30th, the event known as the Double Event had occurred, where Jack the Ripper slaughtered 2 women in a single night, leaving the cobbled streets of the East End slick with blood. Panic had gripped the poorer districts like a vice, but the terror was now rapidly bleeding into the wealthier, aristocratic neighborhoods, fueled by a sensationalist press that sold papers on pure hysteria. At the center of this raging firestorm stood the Metropolitan Police, an organization that was looking increasingly incompetent, desperate, and overwhelmed by an invisible enemy. Detectives were chasing phantoms, arresting innocent men in the streets, and sifting through hundreds of taunting letters from individuals claiming to be the Whitechapel fiend. Public confidence in law enforcement was completely shattered, and the highest authorities were facing daily vicious calls for their immediate resignation. They desperately needed a swift, decisive victory to prove they still had control over the imperial capital. Instead of a victory, they received the ultimate, devastating humiliation. This brings us directly back to that bitter, damp morning of October 2nd, and the horrifying discovery made by the carpenter, Frederick Wildebourne. The dark, unfinished cellar where he stood trembling, staring at a rotting, tightly bound canvas parcel was not just some random, forgotten construction site on the edge of the river. It was located on the Victoria Embankment in Whitehall, situated in one of the most heavily guarded, prestigious, and politically sensitive areas of the entire city. More importantly, the massive stone foundations rising high above him belonged to the Norman Shaw buildings, a grand architectural project specifically designed and destined to become the brand new, impenetrable headquarters of the Metropolitan Police themselves. It was the future home of New Scotland Yard. What Wildebourne had uncovered in the mud soon became known in official records and the press as the Whitehall Mystery, a case that represented a profound, calculated psychological taunt to the most powerful investigative body in the British Empire. When police surgeons arrived to unspool the black, foul-smelling cloth, they found the mutilated lower half of a female torso. The implications were staggering. The killer had deliberately bypassed roaming night watchmen, navigated a treacherous, unlit labyrinth of wooden scaffolding, and descended into the subterranean vaults of the very institution tasked with hunting down murderers. It was an act of breathtaking audacity. While Jack the Ripper was frantically slashing throats in the dark, desperate alleys of the slums, this unknown torso killer had calmly walked into the fortress of the police and deposited a dissected human being right at their foundation. It was a macabre, highly theatrical joke, a direct message that no one, not even the highest-ranking detectives in the land, was safe from his precise surgical blade. The reaction within the police hierarchy was a volatile mixture of absolute embarrassment and sheer, unadulterated panic. Officers who were already physically and mentally exhausted from patrolling the volatile East End were abruptly pulled back to their own future headquarters, forced to dig through the dirt of their own basements with lanterns and shovels in search of more body parts. To make matters infinitely worse, the press immediately seized upon the dark irony of the situation. Newspapers mercilessly mocked the Metropolitan Police, pointing out the grim absurdity that heavily armed detectives were scouring the darkest corners of London for a killer, while a completely different murderer was casually using their own future offices as a personal dumping ground. If the police could not even secure the cellar of New Scotland Yard, the scathing editorials asked, how on earth could they ever protect the vulnerable citizens of London? The political and public pressure on the authorities reached an agonizing, almost unbearable boiling point. Desperate to save face and regain a shred of their lost authority, the police launched a massive, frantic search of the surrounding Whitehall area. They deployed their finest, most experienced men, scrutinized the background of every single laborer who had access to the construction site, and even brought in highly trained bloodhounds to scour the embankment for any lingering scent of the killer. Briefly, a genuine glimmer of hope emerged from the gloom. Weeks later, an arm and a shoulder matching the Whitehall torso were discovered, and investigators truly believed they had finally found the elusive trail that would lead them directly to the killer's indoor slaughterhouse. They thought the net was finally closing in on this arrogant fiend. But just as the desperate police thought they had a solid lead, the killer pulled off his most frustrating trick. He vanished completely into the impenetrable London fog, leaving the authorities grasping at shadows and proving that his reign of terror was far from over. As the news of the Whitehall Mystery broke, a single terrifying question echoed through the smog-filled pubs and frightened drawing rooms of London. Had Jack the Ripper changed his style? For a city already pushed to the absolute brink of mass hysteria, it was entirely natural to attribute every macabre discovery to the one monster they already knew. The public and the sensationalist press immediately assumed that the Whitechapel fiend had simply grown bolder, evolving from leaving his victims in the dirty gutters to dropping their severed pieces directly onto the doorstep of the police. They genuinely believed they were facing a single, omnipotent madman who could strike anywhere, at any time, in any gruesome manner he chose. To separate forensic fact from this swirling public fiction, Scotland Yard turned to the most respected medical mind of the era, Dr. Thomas Bond. As a pioneering police surgeon and an early architect of what we now call criminal profiling, Dr. Bond was arguably the only man in England uniquely qualified to read the grim, silent language of these mutilated bodies. He had personally examined the remains of Jack the Ripper's victims, staring directly into the chaotic aftermath of the Whitechapel butcher's blade. If anyone knew the Ripper's bloody, unmistakable signature, it was Dr. Bond. When he stood in the cold, dimly lit mortuary to examine the Whitehall torso, the authorities eagerly awaited his confirmation. Instead, he delivered a chilling conclusion that would completely rewrite the criminal history of Victorian London. In his meticulous medical reports, Dr. Bond declared definitively that the torso was not the work of Jack the Ripper. The physical evidence simply did not match. By examining the remains side by side with his extensive notes on the Whitechapel victims, Bond mapped out the psychological and physical profiles of two entirely distinct predators hunting in the very same city. The contrast in their modus operandi was staggering. Jack the Ripper was a blitz attacker. He was an opportunistic, frenzied killer who ambushed his victims in pitch-black alleyways and filthy courtyards. His crimes were executed in a matter of frantic minutes, characterized by explosive rage, rapidly slashed throats, and hasty, brutal mutilations before he fled back into the night. The Ripper's work was loud, messy, and infinitely chaotic. But the man responsible for the Thames Torso Murders was an entirely different breed of killer. Dr. Bond noted that the cuts on the Whitehall torso demonstrated a frighteningly calm, methodical approach. This killer possessed a clear, practical knowledge of human anatomy, specifically the mechanics of the skeletal system. He did not hack wildly through solid bone with a heavy butcher's blade. Rather, he used specialized knives to carefully disarticulate the limbs, severing the complex joints with surgical precision. Even more disturbing, forensic examination revealed that the victim's tissues were remarkably pale. The killer had taken the immense time and effort to completely drain the body of its blood before systematically dismantling it. This level of clinical, undisturbed detachment could never be achieved in a dark, perilous alley with a police whistle echoing in the distance. It required a highly controlled environment, a private indoor space with lighting, proper drainage, and absolute, uninterrupted privacy. But the true nightmare wasn't just how the torso killer operated. It was what his hidden existence actually meant for the people of the city. When Dr. Bond's conclusions quietly filtered through the upper echelons of the police and eventually bled into the public consciousness, a new, suffocating wave of dread washed over the capital. The horrifying realization took root that there wasn't just one boogeyman stalking the fog. There were two. Two distinct, highly prolific serial killers were operating simultaneously, sharing the exact same hunting grounds without ever crossing paths. And while Jack the Ripper was a chaotic butcher, making all the terrifying headlines, this second monster was a cold, calculating phantom operating in total silence. He was smarter, infinitely more patient, and completely invisible. The Ripper left bloody crime scenes that shocked the world, but the torso killer left no crime scenes at all. Only a macabre trail of human puzzle pieces that proved the most dangerous predators are the ones who treat murder like a quiet, disciplined trade. As the oppressive heat of summer settled over the city in June of 1889, the Thames once again became a conveyor belt of nightmares. Down in Battersea, a sprawling industrial district on the south bank, the river began to regurgitate a new sequence of horrifying discoveries. Over the course of several agonizing days, local watermen and patrolling river police fished multiple macabre parcels from the murky currents. The killer was no longer just quietly dumping bodies. He was practically delivering his gruesome packages directly to the authorities, scattering them across the tides in a calculated display of supreme arrogance. Each bundle contained a perfectly severed portion of human anatomy, and once assembled upon the cold porcelain tables of the local mortuary, they formed the incomplete remains of a young woman. For months, the police had been chasing a faceless, nameless phantom who preyed upon equally anonymous victims. But this time, the forensic examiners stumbled upon a rare, tragic stroke of luck. During the meticulous post-mortem, doctors noted a series of distinct, well-healed surgical scars on the victim's wrist and lower abdomen. Furthermore, they made a heartbreaking medical determination. The young woman had been approximately 8 months pregnant at the time of her brutal murder. By cross-referencing these highly specific physical traits with recent missing persons reports, Scotland Yard achieved something unprecedented in this entire sprawling investigation. Out of the 4 major torso cases that terrorized the city between 1887 and 1889, this was the only victim to ever be officially identified. Her name was Elizabeth Jackson. Giving Elizabeth back her name did not bring closure. Instead, it added a crushing weight of emotional tragedy to an already horrifying narrative. To understand Elizabeth's fate is to understand the exceptionally harsh reality of Victorian London. The city was a merciless machine that ground down the impoverished, but it was an absolute death sentence for a destitute, pregnant woman without a husband. Shunned by polite society, turned away from respectable lodgings, and physically incapable of enduring the brutal, bone-breaking labor of the workhouses, Elizabeth would have been entirely marginalized. She was navigating the most unforgiving streets in the world, carrying a child and desperately searching for any fleeting moment of safety or warmth. It is profoundly devastating to reconstruct how the predator likely exploited this immense vulnerability. Jack the Ripper had to hunt his victims in the dark, relying on sudden violence to overpower them before they could cry out. The torso killer did not need to hunt. He only needed to offer a false sense of salvation. Elizabeth Jackson did not die in a dark alleyway fighting for her life. She was almost certainly lured indoors by a man who appeared decent, someone who perhaps offered her a hot meal, a few shillings, or simply a secure room away from the damp, dangerous night air. She trusted the wrong man purely because survival left her with absolutely no other choices. Stepping willingly into the private abattoir he had so carefully prepared, armed with her identity, Scotland Yard launched a ferocious, desperate investigation. Detectives finally had a starting point. They relentlessly canvassed the homeless shelters, questioned local publicans, and traced Elizabeth's known associates, desperately trying to map her final steps through the neighborhoods of Chelsea and Battersea. They hunted for anyone who might have seen her walking with a stranger in her final days. But the trail went agonizingly cold. Because the killer operated entirely within the heavily fortified sanctuary of his own home or workshop, there were no witnesses to a public struggle. No one heard a scream. No blood stained the public cobblestones. The sheer privacy of his methods completely insulated him from the massive police dragnet sweeping the city. The brief, desperate glimmer of hope that had arrived with the identification of the victim quickly flickered out, leaving the frustrated detectives staring blankly into the impenetrable fog. Elizabeth gave them a name, but the killer was about to give them one final, horrifying puzzle. In September of 1889, the killer delivered what would become his final defiant puzzle. A mutilated female torso was discovered hidden under a dark railway arch on Pinchin Street. The location of this grisly find was absolutely no accident. Pinchin Street was situated squarely in the heart of Whitechapel, the undisputed hunting ground of Jack the Ripper. For the exhausted and thoroughly demoralized detectives of Scotland Yard, This brazen drop raised a chilling, unprecedented question. Were they witnessing a macabre turf war between two distinct serial killers? The Torso Killer seemed to be deliberately encroaching on his rival's territory, leaving his meticulously dismembered victim in the very streets where the other monster had so recklessly spilled blood. This terrifying escalation could no longer be contained within the foggy boundaries of London. The news of the Pinchin Street discovery, combined with the lingering, humiliating horror of the Whitehall Mystery, rapidly crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Major American publications, most notably the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune, began running sensational stories detailing the exploits of this methodical British butcher. They painted a horrifying picture for their readers of a sophisticated, surgical killer who made the frantic alleyway attacks of the Ripper look like the work of an amateur. For the first time, a profound global anxiety took root as citizens in the United States realized that if a predator this disciplined could operate entirely undetected in the heart of the British Empire, no bustling modern metropolis was truly safe. That transatlantic terror would ultimately prove to be deeply prophetic, bringing our story full circle. Decades later, when the infamous Cleveland Torso Murders began tearing through the United States in the 1930s, early American criminologists and law enforcement officials found themselves facing a horrifyingly familiar pattern. As they struggled in vain to catch the butcher of Kingsbury Run, they frantically dug through historical archives, heavily studying the exact forensic reports of the London Thames Torso Murders. They came to the chilling realization that the precise method of indoor disarticulation, the meticulous draining of blood, and the scattered disposal of body parts had a dark, unpunished Victorian precedent. The American nightmare they were living was in fact an echo of a British original, yet, just as this transatlantic fascination reached its peak, the Thames Torso Killer simply vanished into the smog. After the Pinchin Street Torso in 1889, the macabre deliveries to the river and the streets abruptly ceased. This sudden, absolute silence left behind a massive void of unanswered questions that continues to haunt true crime historians to this very day. Did this cold, calculating phantom finally succumb to a fatal illness or a quiet accident in his private indoor slaughterhouse? Was he quietly incarcerated in a Victorian asylum, or perhaps imprisoned for a completely unrelated minor offense under a false identity? Or, in a scenario that deeply terrified those early American detectives, did he simply pack his specialized surgical tools, board a steamship, and seamlessly relocate his deadly trade to the United States? Jack the Ripper became an immortal legend of true crime because he was inherently chaotic, relentlessly bloody, and possessed a twisted theatrical flair, actively taunting the police with ink-stained letters. He was the terrifying public boogeyman that the Victorian press desperately needed to sell newspapers. But when we look back through the cold, objective lens of forensic history, the Thames Torso Killer was undeniably the truly successful predator. While the Ripper left behind frantic, blood-soaked crime scenes in the muddy streets, this phantom surgeon left absolutely nothing behind but fragmented, unsolvable puzzles. He operated with chilling patience, dismantled his victims in a secure, hidden indoor sanctuary, and ultimately faded away into the dense London fog, completely unpunished and forever unidentified. In his silent escape, he left us with a profoundly terrifying realization. He proved that the most dangerous monsters in our society aren't the loud, impulsive butchers who make the front page headlines, but rather the cold, calculating phantoms who treat the act of murder like a quiet, highly disciplined trade. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into one of the most chilling and historically overlooked chapters of true crime. I want to hear your theories regarding the sudden, unexplained disappearance of this Victorian butcher. Do you think the torso killer simply died quietly in a London workhouse, or is it entirely possible that he packed his surgical tools, boarded a steamship across the Atlantic, and carried his deadly blueprint to America? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey into the dark heart of the past, please remember to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to check the links in the show notes for more fascinating deep dives into unsolved Victorian mysteries. And I will see you again soon for another true crime episode.